Good morning, everyone. This is Chris DiFonzo with Michigan State University. I was scheduled to do the virtual breakfast July 27th and had a family emergency. So this is sort of an addendum, an extra that I'm giving you now for insect issues at the end of July. So the first thing I'd like to do is just give a little of a taste of some of the identifications that have come in the last couple of weeks. The first one comes from Jeff Boswell in Litchfield, and he said, "What the heck is this thing that's sitting here on the corn plant?" This is soybean nodule fly. They're actually extremely common. The larvae feed under the ground on soybean roots, and the adults come out right about this time. They will be in soybean. You'll see them if you're sweeping, but they also love to sit on corn. And you see here, this is probably a male and a female. They will do mating displays, and that's probably what's going on here. They're harmless. They don't have any effect on soybean yield, but boy, you see a lot of them sometimes, especially if you're sweeping in beans or walking and scouting corn. This is another picture sent in, this on soybeans. This is soybean mealybug. So this would be the plant has been pulled up, and under the ground there are these mealybugs on roots. Mealybugs, certain species are on the top of the plant. Other species are under the ground and feeding on roots. And again, it's a sucking sort of pest. They're white because they're covered with wax that protects them from the elements. So this picture was sent in, and Matt was asking, are these troublesome? Do they rob yield? The entomologist in the last few years had some money to work on soybean mealybug because we don't really know anything about them. And we had money to do some sampling and see if they were doing anything. And the funny thing is we couldn't find any. So they're out there, but they're not very common. It was dry earlier in the season. Mealybugs are sucking pests. These probably did a little bit better. But again, more of a curiosity. We see them every now and then on an individual plant, and I don't think it's really anything to worry about. This last identification came from Charles Scoville. This was the front, I believe it was someone doing hay, and on the front of the tractor, it was covered with these bright green bugs, and I could see, even though the picture's a little bit out of focus, I could see pink antennae, and I'm 99% sure that it's this rice leaf bug, and I've given you a nice picture on the right. Up until about maybe 8 to 10 years ago, I'd never really seen this insect. Its range was a little bit south of Michigan, but as the climate has warmed, it has moved into Michigan, and I see it a lot now. I see it in cornfields when I walk them. I've seen it in hemp and when we're sweeping beans. So it's a little sucking bug. It's a mirid. It's related to a lot of the other plant bugs, and I don't think it's doing anything economic. It's just sort of hanging out there, and it's very distinct because it has that pink and antennae. So it's not really doing anything. So those are three insects that you might see, but are not ones that we would worry about. Getting into the ones we would worry about, Western bean cutworm flights has been flying maybe for about 3 weeks now. Um, the point of trapping is that you trap every year and you understand what a high and low number is in your area. So on the MSU campus where I trap a lot, my numbers are a little higher than normal. These are numbers sent in for Southwest Michigan by Mike Swash. These are individual traps in a week, and you can see how much the trap count can vary from 37 at one location to over 200. And that's why trapping at individual sites is pretty important. And from Mike and a few other people, they've seen more Western bean cutworms than in the previous few years. So the flight seems a little bit larger. Probably overwintering was quite good because it was warmer. So Western bean cutworm trap data goes into this online website that comes through Ontario. And this is a picture from earlier in the week. The circles represent the trap catch in an individual trap. The bigger the circle, the more that's being found. And you can see there's a big, a big count in Ontario as their traps have come up, and they've had pretty high infestation for the last couple of years. You can see that higher trap catch in Southwest Michigan, and then here's one of my traps in Lansing, over 70. When you're trapping for corn, the trap is telling you the timing of the flight so that you can optimally go out and scout at peak. I would say if you're in southern Michigan, central Michigan, you should be scouting your corn now. Maybe if you're in the upper part of the state, your peak is going to be maybe next week. For dry beans, but the numbers in the bucket don't tell you anything for your individual cornfield other than that there's the potential for a high or low infestation. In dry beans, it's different because the moths are not being attracted to one stage or the other. They're just going to dry beans no matter what stage that they're at. So the intensity of catch is useful to tell you that you have to take management or not. So in corn, we can actually find egg masses. We can't find egg masses in dry beans, it's just too hard. But in corn, we're using the egg mass count to determine if we need to spray. And those egg masses will start off bright white, and then as they develop over about a week, they'll go to tan and then purple. I've already received pictures of hatching egg masses in southern Michigan in Montcalm County, so hatch has started. I've also received pictures, and I don't have it in here, of egg masses that have purple eggs and then some not purple eggs. The egg mass should develop all at one time, meaning all the eggs should be tan or all the eggs should be purple. When you see egg masses that have a few purple eggs and the rest are not purple, the ones that haven't turned, those are not viable eggs. They've died for some reason. They've gotten fungus, they've been predated upon, or poked and fed on. They weren't fertilized, perhaps, if the female didn't have enough sperm in her. So when you see those egg masses that are vary in color, that means that uh, most of that egg mass or some of that egg mass is not going to hatch, which is a good thing. So in corn, in the top of the diagram here in the yellow, again, the trap counts don't necessarily relate to infestation. If you get 500 in a trap, but your cornfield is not very attractive to the moths, it's not at that pre-tassel stage, you may have almost no infestation in that field. The trap counts are simply telling you that you've got a high intensity of flight. Maybe it's time to get out there and actually look, see what's going on. Your crop stage is key. You're looking for those pre-tassel fields, especially if your field is the latest the latest or the earliest in the neighborhood. You might attract in these moths for egg laying, and that's how you can get some really high counts. The action threshold is 5% of the plants with egg masses, and that's cumulative. It's kind of challenging. Let's say you go out and in the first week, 1% of the plants are infested. Those eggs will hatch in a week, and then if you come back and scout again, if you've got 4% of the plants infested, that's a total of 5, and that would be the action threshold. The threshold is not for yield loss. Most of the time, as you see in the little picture to the right, the insects will prefer to do tip feeding in areas where there really were no kernels anyway, but they will open up that ear and cause damage that could lead to fungal infection and then mycotoxin issues later. So this threshold is low and is geared for a quality issue, not a quantity issue. If you're going to tank mix with a fungicide, and a lot of people do, optimize that fungicide timing. Don't worry so much about the insecticide. You're going to kill what you're going to kill within a 7 to 10 day time frame, and you might get some late eggs hatching, and there's nothing that you can do about that. In dry beans, it's much easier. The trap counts are related to infestation often. So the higher the trap count, the more chance of the dry beans being infested, because dry bean stage doesn't matter if it's flowering or not, for instance. We know that the risk of having Western bean is higher if the cumulative catch in traps that are nearby are at least 120. So most people will go out and trap. If they get 120, 150, they'll think, okay, I've got to spray in the next week or two. You have time to do this. Once you spray, those insects are going to move all around in the dry bean canopy, and they're going to crawl over the residue and kill themselves. Especially if your corn has been over threshold, you know that there's a lot flying around. And if your corn isn't attractive anymore, then again, you can get these moths dumping over into the dry beans. If you really want to look at a threshold, we have kind of an action threshold after you reach that 120 or 150 of about 10 to 12% of the pods fed on. But frankly, most people aren't going out there to look at the pods. They're hitting the 120, 150, and then they're spraying in the next week or two, especially if they have potato leafhopper that can double up that spray. I threw this picture in here to remind me to tell you that there's a lot of things that kill Western bean cutworm besides predators and maybe some parasitoids and fungi. And one of the big things that can kill them would be a rain event. So when these egg masses hatch, the little larvae are crawling across the plant, as you see on the left, and they're going up into the tassel to feed. Then they have to crawl back down into the ear zone, and then they'll be in the ears for the rest of their life. But when they're little, if there's a big rain event, as there has been in the last week or two, that can wash a lot of larvae off the plant and do a great job of mortality. So some of these rains that we've had, if they're timed right, may have washed off some of these little Western beans. Same thing for corn borer. Corn borers can have a lot of mortality because of rain as well. So that brings us to this picture sent in from Jessica Rader. This was a field where she said that 1 to 5% of the plants have this European corn borer damage. You can see shot holing on the right, and then a tassel where the corn borer has fed inside that tassel, and there's a little bit of poop and some holes in there too. So 1 to 5% of the plants, I forgot if Jessica told me that this was a BT field. I can't remember if it was. It seems like it was a non-BT, but even in a BT field, remember you have a 5% of the plants are not BT typically. So you could find a few plants that have corn borer damage, and those could be the non-BT refuge plants. In a non-BT field, if you see 1 to 5% of the plants that are infested, at this point, they're boring probably into the plant. Here, they're definitely starting to go into the plant. For second generation corn borer, the thresholds are based on egg masses. So unfortunately, getting to this stage where they're already starting to go into the plant, if you tried to attempt to spray now, I don't think there'd be good efficacy. A crude threshold is 50% of the plants with egg masses for second generation, but there are some very detailed worksheets for corn borer that take into consideration all of the economics, the spray cost, the cost of the gas to go over the field, the expected yield, the expected grain price. There's some very good worksheets out there from back in the day when corn borer was a much bigger problem. But in this case, a crude threshold would be 50% of the plants with egg masses. I don't think that she had that. And at this point, I think spraying wouldn't be very useful anyway, because once they bore into the plant, your efficacy goes way down. They are not exposed to spray at that point. Another insect that's being seen in corn, I've gotten several calls about this, is rootworm adults. So rootworm adults, if they come out before tassels and before silk, are a little bit hungry, so they start to strip the leaves, as you can see here. And they often will, it's almost like if one starts to strip a leaf, then they all begin to strip on the same leaf. Now that looks dramatic, but usually once a tassel starts to come out, as you see here, they'll start to feed in the tassel a bit and feed on silks. Um, Rootworm populations really took a dive about 2013, 2014, and we've had about almost 10 years sort of without a lot of reports of them. But I think they're starting to build back. So especially if you have continuous corn, even corn that's been in the field for a few years, you may not have thought about rootworm very much. Maybe your BTs are working, but this may be that in the next few years that these rootworm populations are going to build back because we're seeing it in the adults essentially. As far as adult feeding, again, the leaf feeding is kind of trivial, looks ugly, but what you'd be keying in on is your silks and making sure that they're not eaten back to within half an inch between the rootworm adults and the Japanese beetles. I've only ever seen this a few times, and they were all in fields where there were BT field failures, where literally the BT failed, and that was back in 2012. And boy, those silks were really clipped, and every time the silk grew, essentially rootworms clipped the silk so that they were not visible above the husk. And in that case, the yield was severely damaged because of lack of pollination. So if you are someone that's grown continuous corn, especially not growing BT corn, or if you're in an area where there's a lot of continuous corn, maybe you are corn and soybean rotation, but all your neighbors are growing silage. You know, these beetles can be pushed out of their field into your soybeans, and it can affect even first year corn. So if that's you, be looking this year to see what you think your adult populations are so that next year we can be prepared if for some yield loss kind of situations. Finally, soybean aphids. Steve Wenzel sent me these pictures, and what I see in these pictures is a soybean population that's going down. On the left, I see some what looks to be some aphids on a stem, but the other stem looks like it's clean and there's just shed skins. And the leaf especially, this looks like a soybean population that's just taken a dive. The the aphids look kind of whitish. They don't look very healthy. I see what look to be maybe some fungus killed aphids here, and the population just doesn't look good. This leaf is an older leaf, probably doesn't have a lot of nitrogen in it, not good nutrition. So if this is what your aphid populations look like, even if you can count a few hundred, this is not a very good population. This is the kind of situation that is a growing good population on top nitrogen-rich leaves. And when we're looking at the soybean aphid threshold of 250 per plant on every plant, this is the kind of thing that we're counting as a growing population. Economic damage doesn't start until over 600 aphids per plant. The aphid thresholds are excellent. They work, they are real, and you can trust them. So when you reach 250 or every plant looks like the picture here, you have about at least a week to make a decision to spray because you've got a week until you get to about 600 or 700 per plant. Most of the fields I've seen this year that started off infested ended up with a lot of good biocontrol and even some fungus. We're starting into August, and this is when we start to get juicier mornings, and our fungus starts to take over. So again, I always am cautious about spraying aphids. We don't want a resistant population. And once we get to R5, you can stop spraying anyway because the aphids tend to be these small white ones. They're not very troublesome. Um, your plant is getting enough water, it's making yield, and the aphid population just is kind of going downhill. So hopefully you didn't have to spray aphids, but if you did, you just targeted the fields that really needed it. A few last things. I always say that the field crop insect guide for Michigan and Ohio is online on the MSU website. All the chapters are free, and you can just download a chapter for a crop. You don't have to download the whole thing. If you can't find it, send me a note and I'll just send you the link directly. And our pheromone trap accounts are always posted on the Great Lakes and Maritimes Pest Monitoring Network. That's a mouthful. That's through Ontario. And we try to put those up every single week, and you have Michigan on there, Ontario, Ohio, and some of the surrounding states. So these are just free resources. Again, if you can't find the link, send me a quick email and I'll get it to you. And with that, sorry I couldn't do the original breakfast, but hopefully this extra update can give you some tips for managing insects in the next week or two. Thanks.